They're big, they're bad, and they're making a comeback. Find out why Havana's camel buses are not only one of the most miserable transport systems on earth, but why it's also a poor man's subway. Hi, this is Jeffrey, and in my last video, we looked at buses that were being exported from Britain to Cuba during the Cold War, and then the loss of those buses in a shipping accident. Now, that video generated a lot of interest, and so I thought I'd do another video about Cuba. Now, this time we're going to look at the camel buses, also known as camellos, and why they are considered a poor man's subway system or metro system. Now, the camellos came into service like in the late 1980s or so, and around 2007, 2008, there were hopes to get rid of them, and most of them were taken out of service. But then they started to appear again within the last year or so due to the economic conditions in Cuba. So we're going to take a look at the camel buses in the first part of the video. Now, in the second part of the video, we're going to look at two attempts to build subway systems in Havana, Cuba. There was one attempt in 1921 and then another attempt like about 1985 or so. So we're going to look at that as well. We're going to review an article about the comeback of the Camelo buses, and then we'll look at another article from the very early 1920s about the project to build a subway in Havana. So let's get started in looking at those articles and viewing images of these incredible camel buses. And here's the article from the Havana Times titled, "With the Crisis, the Camels Return in Cuba," dated May 1st, 2023, by Juan Diego Rodriguez. Havana Times. Last Wednesday, a 14 Medio reporter sent a photo that he had just captured on Avenida del Puerto in Havana. A camelo, otherwise known as Camel, was picking up passengers on a route that took them to La Palma, a neighborhood on the periphery. It was further proof that the fuel shortage was creating a transport crisis similar to the one experienced in the 90s during the special period, which began even before the end of the Soviet subsidy. In 1988, the Cuban engineer Jorge Hernandez Fonseca and his colleagues from the National Office of Industrial Design proposed to the authorities an idea to end the transport crisis in Havana. The vehicle, locally manufactured, would have the capacity to carry more than 300 people on each trip. A few years later, the invention had become the symbol of an entire time of survival, and there was no bus stop at which its arrival was not expected, often in desperation. The idea was for the island to have a kind of a metro on the streets, says 14 Media reporter Hernandez, exiled in Miami. The inventor of the Camel describes as cyclical the collapse of public transport in the capital and in the main cities of the island since the triumph of the revolution. The return of the Metrobus that never was, constructed from 2 or 3 buses assembled with a trailer on an 18-wheel chassis with 2 humps in the ceiling, is no surprise. "I think it is the most sensible thing to quickly alleviate the crisis," says the engineer, although he doubts that the country is in a position to manufacture new buses with the characteristics that the Camels had. Those that circulated during the special period were made by the cargo transport companies and the Army. In addition, he says it had the ability to save fuel due to the large number of passengers it could pick up on a single trip. Hernandez, who has traveled through several capitals of the world, understood that in Cuba of the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no way to sustain an underground subway network. A bus with certain characteristics of the subway was the only option. Everyone who has used a subway knows that mass transport is prioritized over comfort. We must remember the context in which the first metro buses arose, the special period. The fuel crisis that the island is now experiencing, he reflects, is a repetition of that time. Many Cubans, however, thought they had exceeded the time when camels were the only option to get to the work center or move around the city. Today, the few buses that circulate in Havana, least according to their signs, bring with them the bad taste of the economic debacle of the 90s. Criticism of the camel is not only aimed at the bad memories it brings to most Cubans by associating it with the crisis, but also at how hot it is inside, given the many passengers it transports and its small windows. The shocks it causes in the homes located on the avenues where it circulates also adds to its defects. Cubans have more criticisms than compliments about the Camelo, recognizes Hernandez Fonseca, who claims to be no stranger to the discomfort of the vehicle, but it must be understood that there was no other alternative at that time, he says. As the situation is, he does not consider it a thing of the past, nor does he see it as part of a future Cuban transport museum. Translated by Regina Anavi for Translating Cuba, and that's the end of the article. Well, that was really fascinating, wasn't it? To learn that the camel buses of Havana was actually developed as an alternative to a subway system that could not be built or could never be built. Now, what we're going to do next is take a look at an article from the New York Times from 1921 that describes Cuba's attempt to build a subway system in Havana, Cuba, and then we'll take a look at some information about the subway system that was planned again in the 1980s. And here's the article from the New York Times titled Havana Subway Planned, dated August 28, 1921. Cuban Commission approves project modeled on system here. Special to the New York Times. Washington, August 27th. A subway system modeled on that of New York City is planned for the city of Havana by the Cuban government, according to a report to the Department of Commerce today from Carlton Bailey Hurst, American Consul General at the Cuban capital. Plans for the proposed system have been approved by the Cuban Railroad Commission, according to the consul's report, and are now being submitted to the American consulate for inspection. It is planned to send a representative from Havana to New York City in October or November to make a further study of the New York subway system and to arrange for the financing of the project. And that's the end of the article. So here's the second article. It's titled Havana Plans Subway from the LA Times Archives from Reuters. Havana, the first stage of a $900 million Soviet-designed subway, should be completed in Havana within 8 years, the official Cuban newspaper Granma reported Monday. It said test borings have already begun in the capital. And that's the end of this small article. Now, in doing research for this video, I actually found what is reported to be a photograph of a subway tunnel built under 23rd Street in Havana. And there were also some advertisements in newspapers about this upcoming subway system. And I also found a map that was drawn in the 1980s that shows the 3 lines that were planned for the subway system in Havana, and also renderings from the agency that was planning and designing the subway. Wow, what an incredible story that was. So in the 1920s, they tried to design and build a subway in Havana, Cuba that was going to be like the New York subway, and that failed. And then in the 1980s, they tried again to build a subway in Havana with the help from the Soviet Union, and that failed. And so instead of building a subway, they developed and built the Camelo or camel buses. And that didn't work out so well. So if you know anything about the Havana subway that was supposed to have been constructed, let us know, because this is a really fascinating subject. Well, I hope you found this video very, very interesting. And thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. Bye.